Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, April 5th, 2007. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. With this week, David Logsdon, a favorite with Basic Brewing Radio listeners, joins us to talk us through the life cycle of yeast. What's life like for our favorite microorganism, and what can we do to help it along the way to make great-tasting beers? Well, if you're new to home brewing or would like to get into the hobby, check out our website, basicbrewing.com, where you can find archives of our audio and video podcasts and our DVDs to walk you through basic and more advanced brewing techniques. And if you go to basicbrewingvideo.com, you can find this week's episode of Basic Brewing Video. Andy Sparks of thehomebrewery.com helps me to introduce our video tour of Avery Brewing in Boulder, Colorado. We took the tour of Avery Brewing when we were in Colorado for the Great American Beer Festival this past year. And I want to thank Brian Warren for his help during the tour as well. You get to hear Brian ask Adam Avery a couple questions while we were touring. Andy's heading to the 5th annual Boulder Strong Ale Fest, which is coming up this weekend. So I look forward to a report from him. Lots of great tasting beers being featured there. In our video podcast episode on Oscar Blues Brewery, you saw Garrett Marrero from Maui Brewing Company checking out the canning line there at Oscar Blues. Well, I got an email from Garrett announcing their release of 3 beers in cans: Big Swell IPA, Bikini Blonde Lager, and Coconut Porter. Tasty beers, by the way. We got to try them at the Great American Beer Festival. So congratulations to Garrett and everybody at Maui Brewing. And maybe one day we can do a tour of Maui Brewing Company. Wouldn't that be great? I also forwarded Garrett's release to our buddies at Craft Beer Radio, Pacific Brew News Radio, Big Foamy Head, and The Good Beer Show, podcasts that are focused on spreading the word about good beer. So just trying to get the word out about good beer in cans. I also got a letter from Dan in the Philippines. Dan says, here in the Philippines, malted products are hard to get, and malted barley only comes in liquid form, that is, Ovaltine, whiskey, or beer. Dan says, I prefer the latter. I've taken up the challenge and have found a feed shop that sells barley for cheap. By cheap, I mean 10 cents a pound. I've started malting my first batch, and I'm very happy with the results. I listened to and took notes from your interview with BYO's Chris Colby, that's the March 1st, 2007 episode, on malting at home, and also tuned into our Down Under friends at Oz Craft Brewer. All great shows and very helpful. So I'll put a link to Dan's brewing blog on basicbrewingradio.com in the description of this week's episode. And you can follow Dan's exploits on malting his own grain there. And Dan says he's now building a drum roaster with a water hookup. And that'll be fun to check that out online as well. Well, a couple more notes from our discussion with Merle Landman of National Chemicals about iodophore. You may remember we talked about measuring 1/4 of an ounce of iodophore concentrate and mixing that with 2.5 gallons of water. Well, I dropped by the homebrew shop the other day, and Andy's dad, Neil, who works there, brought up the fact that a 1/4 of an ounce is equal to 1.5 teaspoons. So to make life a little easier, measure 1.5 teaspoons of iodophore concentrate to 2.5 gallons of water. So 1.5 teaspoons to 2.5 gallons of water. Thad in Oklahoma City writes with another question about iodophore. Thad says, my question is this: why don't I get a weak tea color out of my solution when mixing to the 12.5 parts per million recommendation? Is it possible that my water chemistry is not conducive to this recommendation? And Thad sent along specs on his water, and it turns out his water's pH is 9.4. And here's what Merle had to say about that. At pH greater than 9, you have what is considered aggressive water. Remember that pH is not a linear scale. Each pH unit is 10 times stronger than the previous, starting with 7 as neutral. So, your water, is almost 500 times more alkaline than pure water. Iodophore is pH sensitive, And in some areas of the U.S., the alkaline water conditions effectively neutralize the product. That's why test strips are so important in the sanitizing process, as they give you a chemical method to measure concentration beyond visual inspection. Merle says, for my product line, I would suggest you look at a low-odor chlorine like the BTF trichlomelanine. Sorry, Merle. I'm not sure how the Star San would fare, since it's an acidic sanitizer in an alkaline environment. That would probably be a question for the folks at 5 Star. Merle says I would suggest either using bottled water or attempt to neutralize the water through filtration and adding a small quantity of mild acid like citric acid. Sounds like a bottled water may be the easier way to go. I'm always on the lookout for products to improve the brewing process, and every now and then someone writes in with sort of an endorsement of something they've been using. Greg from Peachtree City, Georgia, writes, thought I'd give a follow-up to an email I sent you last summer regarding the plastic Better Bottle carboys. At the time, I mentioned that I had been pleased using them as a secondary fermenter from which I could directly bottle from the spigot without needing a bottling bucket. Well, I've since switched entirely to the Better Bottle and believe they are the best thing for brewing since liquid yeast. Greg says, here is my process for ales. Ferment in the Better Bottle, leaving it for 2 weeks. Without racking to a secondary, move the bottle to the fridge and lager it for a week, which will allow most of the various suspended particles in yeast to drop out. Remove the bottle from the fridge and let it return to ambient temperature, then bottle directly from the spigot. I do have to dose each bottle with a sugar solution, but using a medicine dropper from a pharmacy lets me control the amount of carbonation precisely. Greg says, when I dry hop, I put the hops in the same primary fermenter a day or two before moving to the fridge. This gives them some time at ambient temperature, then a week at cooler temperatures. I had been concerned that this process was too easy, and I was attempting to use shortcuts that might potentially be negatively affecting my beer until my recent experience at the 2007 Peach State Brew-Off. I entered 5 beers into 6 categories. Of these, I received 1 honorable mention, Belgian Specialty Ale, 1 second place, Imperial IPA, 2 first places, American Stout and American IPA, and Best of Show with the American IPA. Congratulations, Greg. He says, using the Better Bottles frees me from being concerned about breaking glass and allows me to brew great beer without racking to another container between fermentation and bottling, saving a lot of effort and cleaning, as well as decreasing the potential for contamination and oxidation. Well, that's probably good advice whether you're using the plastic Better Bottles or not. May be a good idea to try not to rack as much as possible so that you're not exposing your beer to oxygen. So, Greg, congratulations, Greg. Appreciate the advice. I haven't tried the Better Bottles myself, but I believe Jeff Bearer from Craft Beer Radio also said he likes them too. Let's get into our review with David Logsdon from Wyeast. You know, it had been a while since we talked to David, so I asked him to come on the show to walk us through the life cycle of yeast. Well, David Logsdon, welcome back to Basic Brewing Radio.
Well, James, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to spend a little time talking beer and talking yeast.
I looked on our website in the archives, and you originally appeared on the show in October of 2005. Can you believe it?
No, that's slipped by awful quickly, hasn't it?
The older I get, the quicker time goes by.
There's a relativity to that.
And often, I mean, I get an email almost every day of someone saying, you know, I just discovered your show recently, and I'm going through the archives, and I'm really enjoying the shows, and especially the ones with David Logsdon. So you are greatly appreciated out there, and I certainly appreciate all the information that you've given us on that series, and then since we've talked to you a couple times as well. So
thanks for the opportunity to help get the word out. I couldn't do it without you, James.
And there's almost a psychic connection, I think, between you and the listeners, because yesterday I received 2 email questions almost together asking questions of you. and I had not publicized that I was going to be talking to you.
Well, is that timely or what?
Yeah. So our topic is going to be the life cycle of yeast, but I want to throw these two questions at you since I've got them, and maybe we can knock those out and then get into the meat of the topic. The first one comes from Aaron in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He says that he heard you talking about aeration and oxygen levels, and he says he recently used his racking cane and siphoning tube in reverse to pump air into his wort. He then shook the carboy for about 30 seconds. Is the RRC, that's the reverse racking cane method, okay, or am I introducing tons of bacteria from my unfiltered air? He said he just stuck his tube in the bottom of the carboy and pumped away on the auto siphon like crazy. So what do you think? Is he doing more harm than good there?
Well, I don't know if that's too much harm. The environment that he's in is probably going to have something to do with that. Generally, anytime we're working with open cultures or an area where contamination from the air might be a factor, minimum airflow in the room or drafts and things like that are going to help minimize that. And if you think about it, when brewers aerate their wort with a wire whisk or a spoon to stir it and rouse it really well, they're doing something similar to that effect. And if he's incorporating air by sucking up in through the tube, if the tube's clean and the air is relatively still, I don't think he's going to find himself contaminating probably beyond any other means that a lot of brewers try to aerate their wort. The main thing is getting oxygen in there, and if it's working for him, that's what's going to be the bottom line. That's where it's important, is getting enough oxygen in order to get that yeast metabolism underway. So if you could put a filter on it, there are some sterile filters out there that are pretty simple and available to home brewers. That would be one step of precaution that he could take along the way that might benefit his peace of mind, if nothing else.
Yeah, I guess you got a point. If you're aerating your wort by shaking it or by stirring it with a whisk or by pouring it vigorously from one container to the other, you're introducing the same sort of air that he's introducing by using his reverse racking cane method. So.
Yeah, and again, if his racking cane is clean and his tubes are clean, sanitized properly, and he doesn't have a lot of draft or dusty air about where he's working at, he's probably not doing much different than other people would be by those other methods.
Well, there you go. He might have discovered a new aeration method there. And the second question is from Craig in Abilene, Texas, on cold pitching yeast. He says cold pitching involves making a starter, and once it's done fermenting, placing it into the refrigerator to allow the yeast to fall out. You then decant the liquid off and pitch the cold slurry into the wort. Allegedly, this process has put the yeast into the optimum state to begin propagating and fermenting the wort into our beloved beverage. And he says, I wonder what Mr. Logsdon thinks about that.
Well, that's not an uncommon practice by any means. Professional brewers as well often employ that type of method to grow their yeast to a volume to get it to pitching levels, and probably a beer type that benefits most from that would be a lager or pilsner style beer, where you do want to ferment cold and start cold, and by allowing the yeast to settle off at the end of their propagation, they build their glycogen reserves, which is important, and then removing that beer or the liquid that it was propagated in, which is going to have a flavor impact, especially if there's much aeration and warmer temperatures involved. Then you're going to have some esters and some flavor compounds in there that may detract from the quality of a nice crisp Pilsner beer. So that method is a good method, and it's one that, like I say, is commonly used by a number of brewers.
And is it better to pitch cold yeast into a relatively warmer wort than the other way around?
Well, it depends a little bit on the circumstances, James. If you're propagating yeast and you're at around room temperature or up to 68 to 75 Fahrenheit, which is pretty common for good yeast growth, and you're stepping it up or propagating and then getting ready to pitch, and you have it in active fermentation, and you don't have that opportunity to let it settle, pitching a little warmer, it gives the yeast a little bit easier assimilation into the wort and can take up fermentation a little quicker. Setting it into cold wort, sometimes it, especially for ale yeast, if you get it down in the low 60s or down in that lower range of their fermentation, the cell walls just lose some of their elasticity in that colder environment. The lipids are more solid than fluid, and it can cause a little bit of slower start. It typically does. Whether or not that's bad or not, that's debatable, but it is different.
It sounds like both of our brewers are on the right track there.
Yeah, it sounds like they're doing well. They didn't say how the beer was tasting, and like I say, that's the bottom line. If the fermentation went effectively and the beer turned out to be what they expected, then that's what we're all after.
That's right. And speaking of starters, you were recorded a presentation that you did down in I think Australia, down south there, either Australia or New Zealand. I think it was Australia. It was recorded by Graham Sanders of Craft Brewer Radio, and he put that on his podcast a few months ago. And I have recommended that to listeners who've asked questions about starters, because that presentation that you gave was really, I learned a lot. It was very complete, and it was the better part of an hour, and you took questions afterwards. And if people have questions about starters, finding that episode of Craft Brewer Radio is probably a good thing to do.
Well, one thing I'd like to say in regards to that, I did make a little bit of an introduction to a article that Jamil Zanichev was putting together, and I have to give him credit for most of what I had brought to that discussion that day. So I want to make sure Jamil knows that the work he did was very helpful and beneficial, and I kind of worked around a bit of what he had done in his preparation of that article and getting it out to the people so they could be looking for that when it gets published.
Well, excellent. I'm glad you brought that up. I want to make sure that everybody gets the credit that they deserve, and Jamil certainly gets a lot of credit nowadays for all the work that he's doing.
He's a great guy and a great asset to the brewing community.
Well, let's get into the meat of the topic today, the life cycle of yeast. And this is a topic that I suggested because I thought it would give us an excuse to kind of talk about how the yeast works and how, some opportunities that we can have to help them out. So where do you want to start in the life cycle?
Well, we basically it's an ongoing perpetual motion when you think about it, because it's often described as the cycle of yeast is from the time it completes a cell division and starts a new one. So it's continually growing and budding, making daughter cells, and when one daughter cell drops off, and the next one is essentially beginning again. That's the life cycle in a nutshell, and that's to kind of point out that the yeast, being a living organism, when it's in its dormant state, that metabolism is basically slowed to a near standstill, and that's what most home brewers should probably think about, is whenever they have a package of liquid yeast or yeast that they're going to be using in brewing, that's laying there in its dormant state, and it was grown up from a culture, pure culture, that was stepped up over sequential inoculations to larger volumes and more growth under aerobic conditions where a lot of oxygen is supplied to produce cells instead of ethanol during the growing cycle. So from the time that that cell came out of a freezer under nitrogen at minus 80 C or under a slant with mineral oil. That's a working culture out of a refrigerator. It was grown up and brought up to a state where it viability and vitality, it was in good condition, and now they have a package of yeast and they want to make some beer. They're either going to pitch that right into their batch of beer, or some people are going to make a starter culture from that first in order to enhance that metabolism. As the yeast have been laying dormant, they're utilizing their reserves, primarily glycogen reserves that they have that they need also for that start of fermentation. So when we pitch that yeast, whether it's into a starter or into a batch of beer, we're going to get that metabolism moving again, because we're bringing it up into the temperature range that yeast will metabolize effectively. And we're going to supply the one thing that yeast don't get from a starter or from wort that's made from barley and adjuncts, or barley and wheat. But they have to have that oxygen to start the metabolism process, and that's what we talked about in the beginning of the show, the aeration of the wort, how critical it is. If we can get aeration in as much as possible, as feasible and practical, we're going to give that wort about 10 parts per million dissolved oxygen. And most yeast need about 8 to 10 parts per million. So whatever we can do, whether we're pumping it reverse wise through a racking cane, or if we've got a bottle oxygen with a stone and we're going to aerate it, we're going to get in as much as possible, because the yeast are going to take that up in a matter of hours. And they're going to produce sterols, gosterol being one of the primary ones, that they're going to need for cell synthesis. And they start taking that up, and there's some enzymes in the yeast that actually start tearing away at a section of the cell wall, so that a daughter cell or a bud scar can be produced as another cell begins to develop. And even as that daughter cell is being formed on the yeast, it's that daughter cell is also starting to bud as well in good condition. So we're going to get that aeration, oxygen or aeration available for the yeast. It's going to be there for at least a couple hours in the onset of fermentation, and then it's going to go anaerobic and begin fermentation as we know it.
And from listening to your talk on starters, is there such a thing as over-oxygenating a wort?
You can, but it's pretty difficult. One thing, you produce a lot of other flavor compounds under a lot of oxygen, and if that starter is pitched into the wort, that's going to have a little bit of an effect on the overall flavor profile. But it's difficult for people to do that, and there's other things, sheer mechanical stress on the yeast. If there's inadequate sugars or polysaccharides and nitrogen compounds, or some of the free amino nitrogen that the yeast need, and you're aerating without those, then that can be an issue. So you got to have the limiting factor. Oftentimes it's the amount of sugar or carbon that the yeast are taking up as being the kind of the guide on how much oxygen we're adding. Because if we're adding oxygen beyond what there are nutrients to take up, then that's not going to be of any benefit to the yeast. And it could be detrimental.
But in a normal brewing situation, if you've got 5 gallons worth of wort, and say you've got an oxygen tank and an air stone, is there a practical danger of putting too much oxygen? And how long would you have to go to put too much oxygen?
I think once you the rule that I've always kind of followed was, if you're putting any oxygen in beyond 14 hours after pitching, then you're definitely too far. Some brewers will aerate or add oxygen at different points along the process on high gravity beers in particular, and they'll oxygenate late in the 14-hour period in order to make sure that they have a suitable amount of oxygen in there. Normally that's not necessary, especially if you've got oxygen in a centered stone. You can get up to about 40 parts per million of oxygen into the wort pretty easily that way, and if you have the yeast in there, within about 2 hours, that oxygen will drop down all the way near zero because it'll get utilized or get pushed out extremely quickly.
If I were to have my oxygen stone, my air stone, and if I gave it even, say, 2 minutes worth of oxygen in a normal gravity beer, I'm not going to hurt anything?
No, I don't. No, I would be very surprised if you had any adverse effects from that.
Okay, so it's better to err on having a
little too much than not enough.
There you go. That's what I was trying to get at, I guess.
Yeah. That's the only place in the brewing process that oxygen is important, necessary, and valuable. And then after that, like I say, it gets pushed out extremely quickly as you start to produce CO2 that purges that any residual oxygen out of the wort in a very effective way.
So where are we in the process? Our yeasts are producing daughter cells. They're budding, and what now?
Well, they're rapidly taking up the sugars and the amino acids that they need for healthy growth, and it's a very quick and high energy producing process. And the fermentation, as we know it, in most cases, will go about 4 generations on a yeast cell, and after that point, the sterols that was produced from the oxygen uptake are pretty much depleted. So in most brewing cycles, that yeast cell that's producing daughter cells will only do so for about 4 times over the course of that fermentation.
So that's why it's important to pitch the right amount of yeast.
Pitch the right amount and because it's just not a perpetual thing that'll go on forever until everything is converted from sugar to ethanol and carbon dioxide. But it'll have a limited life cycle in that fermentation. So once that happens, that yeast is alive, but it just basically doesn't have the uptake of the nutrients without the sterols that have been depleted in the process. So that's where that at the end of that fermentation cycle, where it's budded about 3 to 4 times, or maybe 5 in some cases, the yeast stops, and optimally the yeast have gone through their full growth. All the sugars are depleted. The ethanol is at that level of a point where you expect from a complete fermentation, and that change in gravity and the lack of the sugars and the increase in the ethanol help the yeast to settle out and flocculate. So that's the stationary phase that the yeast are going to go into at that end of that fermentation. Now, along the way of getting there, they're going to produce glycogen up to maybe 25% of their cell mass, in fact, and that's going to be a nutrient reserve. And essentially, they sense the depletion of nutrients, and they start building glycogen as they reach that terminal gravity at the end of fermentation. So it's all very nicely organized, even though the yeast would just as soon not be producing ethanol in concentrations that becomes toxic to them, because once they do get up around 5% or so, that starts to affect them. But also along the way, just as a matter of effective fermentation for making beer, is that they produce precursors to diacetyl, and they reduce them, and they utilize sulfur from the barley, and that's part of the process they need to utilize the amino acids that are available as well for good cell growth. And these things, over the course of fermentation, reduce effectively to a level that's optimum for flavor profile. A little bit of diacetyl at extremely low levels that are near threshold in some beers is what's needed to give the full flavor profile. There's also a lot of esters and some higher alcohols that are produced during the process, and all these are part of that flavor makeup as well. Now, the management of the fermentation, having good temperatures and that proper pitch rate, that proper aeration, helps keep these things in check so that they pretty much occur without us being too worried or too concerned about it. And that's the nice thing about having a good, healthy yeast to start with, their fermentation, that it goes through the cycle. And as a complex mechanism as it is, it's pretty straightforward when you look at it and see a nice croissant on the carboy and CO2 coming off and seeing it clear at the end of fermentation. It all just works beautifully in a very natural way.
So we've just got to give them the tools, the raw materials.
Give them the right environment and those raw materials let them do their thing. Yeah.
And so they, after they get finished eating all the nutrients in the beer, then do they go back into it? Are we back to the beginning again with the life cycle?
Well, essentially we are, because after fermentation and sedimentation or flocculation, where the yeast fall out of suspension, and if they're in a commercial brewery, they're typically harvested from there and repitched into fresh wort again. And optimally, this would be done within a few days. A couple weeks isn't uncommon for a lot of breweries. It's somewhat strain dependent and a couple other factors. The strength of the beer that you're making, that amount of alcohol that's in it, whether you're fermenting under pressure or not, because ethanol and CO2 are toxic to yeast, and so those things have to be removed effectively or managed properly. Home brewers, that's usually not so much an issue, but if they're going to reuse their yeast, they can use that. And the kind of the thing they need to keep in mind is that a lot of yeast is good as long as it's within a range that's desirable, because you could pitch so much yeast that you get very little growth and there's not much flavor development as well. So even though you get a rapid fermentation, you may not get the flavor profile you want. So it's a little bit of a judicious control of harvesting the right amount of yeast to repitch. And some beers are more susceptible to overpitching than others, affecting flavor. But if you get too high a pitch rates, it just, like I say, it just lacks some of the character that you may be looking for. Even in a crisp, dry lager beer, overpitched can have adverse effects, as well as underpitching or pitching sluggish yeast or yeast that are not in optimum condition. So you've got that window of opportunity to get a desirable amount, and it's not rocket science, but it's something that does need a little bit of attention. If you go beyond just open up a package of yeast and pitching it, there's some a little bit of yeast management involved along the way to make sure you're keeping things in the best shape possible.
You have a page on your site with good instructions on how to wash yeast, and I noticed that at the bottom of Craig's email from earlier, Craig from Abilene, he says, I would like to know if I wash yeast using the process you describe on your website, would it be a good practice to pitch the washed yeast into a starter to ensure adequate yeast volume and its viability?
Well, it depends on how much was harvested and how long it's been harvested, and what kind of beer it's going into. If it's in a high-gravity beer, a little bit of growth prior to fermentation isn't a bad thing. The main thing is getting it in some wort relatively quickly. If the osmotic effect of water on the yeast by itself can have a negative impact. Getting it into wort is a good thing. We do a water wash, I'm pretty sure is the one he's talking about, not an acid wash like a professional brewer would do.
That's
which
right.
It does have to get into wort very quickly. But either way, if he's got a good clean culture and he's got a lot of the trub removed from the wash, shouldn't have to do a starter. A lot of times, if you think about it, less handling can be better than trying to do too much. When you've got something that's good and in good condition, just taking care of it in a minimally invasive way might be easier and with effective results by doing less than more.
We talked about in one of the early episodes that as well as doing the washing technique, you can just pitch a new or put a new batch of wort on top of the trube from a previous batch, as long as it wasn't a high gravity beer, and that thing will take off like a rocket. It will, yeah. You remember you've produced about 4 times as the yeast that you started with, so you have yeast in a much higher cell density, and they should be in relatively good health, and they're going to be ready to actively ferment quite quickly. Could there be a risk if you do that? If, say, you do 2 back-to-back 1050 gravity beers, and you do the second one with the yeast sediment from the first one, could there be too much yeast in there for your flavor profile? I think you would notice quite a change, yeah. That's interesting. So it might be, if you're using that technique, it might be a good rule of thumb to kind of step up the gravity of the second batch of beer? Well, that's one advantage of doing it that way, is that you can go into a very high-gravity beer and have suitable cell counts in order to get an effective fermentation, because as the gravity goes up, the cell count should go up as well. In looking at the life cycle of the yeast, you say oxygen is important, but what are the other tips, the main ones that you think are key? Probably the most important aspects of having a good fermentation is fresh yeast, healthy yeast, knowing that you've got a yeast that has high viability and high vitality is probably key, number one. Then having good, clean wort, sterile wort, or wort that's free of contamination. That's also extremely critical. After that, decent temperature control, the right temperature range parameters for the beer style and the yeast that you're using to make that. And then the next aspect probably would be the allowing sedimentation and flocculation, so the yeast have time to reduce diacetyl and settle out to get a clear wort that you can, or beer that you can rack off at that point. And if you're going to reuse your yeast, then using it in a relatively quick period of time after you've harvested it. If it's coming off a high gravity beer, the alcohol is going to have a negative impact on the yeast vitality, as well as if it's in a sealed vessel that's trapping CO2 and have dissolved CO2 in there at a level that's toxic to yeast as well. So there's a couple of things along the end of the line that are critical in the evolution of the yeast to a new batch of beer. Well, those are pretty basic rules. I could say for as complex a mechanism as yeast are, and how many volumes of literature that have been written on it, and how many scientists have evaluated the yeast in its process and brewing and its life cycle. If we just give it the right conditions, it performs a pretty amazing feat without much interference on our part. I appreciate your time again. Well, it's like I say, it's always a pleasure. Certainly enjoy the opportunity to discuss some of these things and bring a little information, maybe open some eyes up for some of the listeners, and perhaps maybe encourage a little more questions and discussion about the matter, so that they feel comfortable and enjoy the process as well. We all like the finished product, we know that. And if we don't worry too much along the way and have a few things in place in the process, it just makes it easier and much more enjoyable. Well, thanks again to David Logsdon. It's always great to talk to David. You can read the article that David mentioned that Jamil Zainasheff wrote about yeast starters in the March-April issue of Zymergy. And in that article, Jamil gives credit to David for helping to supply information. So they're going back and forth, patting each other on the back, and that's great. If we all share good information, everybody benefits out there. And by the way, Jamil's also got a terrific yeast pitching rate calculator on his personal site. If you need to figure out how much yeast to pitch in a beer of a certain gravity and volume, Jamil's calculator makes it easy. And you can find that at mrmalty.com. That's mrmalty.com. And I'll put a link to that site in the description of this week's episode on basicbrewingradio.com. So good work, Jamil, on the calculator. It's pretty cool. Next week, I'm not sure what I'll have. I'm hoping that Andy can come up with some fun stuff from Boulder with the Strong Ale Festival, but if not, we'll have something else worthwhile, I'm sure. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com, or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com, and please don't forget to tell us where you're from. And while you're on our site, you can check out our online shop, where you can find great pricing on our DVDs and a combo deal to save you even more. In our first DVD, Introduction to Extract Home Brewing, we walk you through the extract brewing process step by step from boiling to bottling. And in Basic Brewing, Stepping into All Grain, we take you through the all grain process from milling your grain to collecting your wort. And of course, you can see a listing of the fine folks across the country and around the world who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com. And if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order it online, and I will pack it up and put it in a box and send it to you myself. Thanks to everybody who's continued to click on our Amazon.com link. We appreciate the support. Our featured products this week that were purchased through the link are Minnesotans in the Movies and the Garmin Forerunner 101 wrist-mounted GPS navigator and personal training device. Wow. Thanks again, everybody. And remember, I can't tell who bought what, so no worries. Just click on the Amazon.com logo on our site the next time you feel like Amazon shopping, and we appreciate the support in advance. That's all until next week. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by our buddy Kelly Dodson down in Austin, who also did our logo. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long.